Dr. McGrail is one of the early proponents for digital humanities work at the community college level, and her writings on community college and digital humanities work has been really informative about what we can do at this level within digital humanities work. So I'm going to pass it over to Anne. Anne, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to assume this microphone is working because
Yep.
it's
Sounds great.
we like I said, Mia and I were talking earlier about our 1960s architecture. I'm not used to so much sophistication here. So hello everybody, and thank you so much for coming, and thank you for to Mia and for all the organizers of this event, and to Florida Humanities and to Indian River Community College for its hospitality. Did I say that right? Indian River. First of all, I really believe that community college students need digital humanities. One reason is that digital humanities, or DH as we say, favors a culture of cross-disciplinary collaboration. And it offers a maker ethos and counters some students' perception that humanities are dull. DH draws on and supports multiple literacies and fluencies at once: information literacy, computer literacy, web search literacy, and issues of privacy, etc. Developing DH at the community college, or as I say, DH at the CC, may seem incompatible with our teaching heavy and service burdened professional lives. But right now, students need digital fluency and critical thinking about our information age. They need it as much as upper division students or graduate students and professionals like ourselves. This doesn't mean that every student needs to take a course in digital humanities, however, but I'm thinking that whenever students encounter the humanities, if they can do so within a lens of DH methods and approaches, they will be more prepared for our age. My first encounter with digital humanities was in the late 1990s, when the British Museum put its Beowulf manuscript on the web. And it's hard to describe what a miracle that seemed like to watch it. It's like, you mean that's the real manuscript? And it was like on the computer. I know that most of us can't imagine that anymore. We've come to expect instant availability of digitized treasures and primary sources. And I do think this accessibility is a boon for community college students. Now, if we can get this to work, we'll take a couple minutes to observe one student's encounter with primary source documents in a lightning round capstone assignment from my American literature class.
There's always like synchronicity between classes, and I was taking this Western Civ class where the teacher was bringing up this issue that the Civil War was much more complicated than what we're often presented with. And part of that was that 3 months before hostilities broke out in the Civil War, New York City voted, oh wait, I should do this line. Nobody swore in American history. No. And even though New York was a Union state, as you can see on my cool map, there you go. And there's New York, safely ensconced in the blue states to Union state. But on January 6, 1861, just 3 months before beginning a conflict, New York City Council voted on a proposition which was endorsed by the mayor, who was a Democrat, opposed to Abraham Lincoln's party as Republican, to secede from the Union. And that was just New York City, not the state. The state was opposed. The city, though, which was economically the country, pretty much, for the north half of the US, was into it. So I was like, I want to find something that reflects that as a digital document, which was difficult because I found all kinds of stuff written about it, but it was all transcribed. Except in this newspaper, which was the most widely circulated newspaper at the time in the country. And And interestingly, from 1841 to 1843, I think, Walt Whitman was the chief editor. And then he was fired, it doesn't say why. On January 7th, 1861, the Monday edition, I found this editorial. Oh, wait, there's a slide in between, sorry. The editorial does not seem concerned with the ethical components of slavery. It states as its concern the unconstitutional demand that depriving slave owners of their property represents. So a common viewpoint for people who have money and are concerned with the economy at this time was that slaves were property. And since slaves were legal at the time, they were concerned that it was unconstitutional to outlaw slavery because the Constitution guaranteed rights of people to their property. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
They have important languages. So
Yeah.
important.
Yeah.
People always ask me why.
So the document's very long, and I was looking for succinct quotes that would help, but they were difficult to find because whoever wrote this wrote like these run-on sentences that went for 700 words with 50 commas in the middle and this flowery adjectives that were annoying. So there's one. Not only this government, but every government that ever deserved the name has for its chief function the protection of property. And at the bottom of this one, there's one that's longer, but I'll go ahead and read it even though it scrolls. When our present government was formed, property and slaves existed in every state in the Union, and the federal compact provided not only for its protection, but its restoration in case of escape from one state to another. And then in the middle of this screen here, it says, if the South had got up an agitation against the commercial rights of New York, the fisheries of New England, the coal interests of Pennsylvania, and formed a platform limited to a declaration of hostility to one or all of these interests, and elected a president who himself and the officers chose to form his cabinet, you can see what I'm talking about, and declared that they must and should perish through the agency of the federal government, and the states concerned should demand to know whether their assumption of power would be followed by the perversion of the machinery of the government toward their destruction, would New York be a traitor for making the inquiry? So a really long way saying look, if they tried to take away our coal, we'd be mad. How can we take away their slaves? Aren't we mean? So if this was just sort of kind of some wingnut off on the side throwing this out, I think that it would be, dismissible. But this was actually voted on the night before this was published by the city council. It was voted down, but it wasn't. But it was a fairly close vote. So interestingly, 2 years later, there were the bloodiest and deadliest riots in the history of the U.S. in New York City. The draft riots, because Abraham Lincoln instituted a draft, and people in New York City were not necessarily pro the war against the South. So I thought with the danger of the single story and all that, this sort of fit into that paradigm. And thanks.
So Stuart's intelligence and humor are immediately apparent here. His presentation illustrates what DH can do for CC students. By digging in these archives, Stuart followed an entire learning arc, first starting with a query, finding relevant digitized records, making cross-disciplinary connections, and drawing an original insight from the cultural record. Such a moment to me demonstrates the democratic potential and inclusivity of DH for CC students. Even at this introductory level, DH can help students make sense of the scale and pace and meaning of technology and its many forms. Using DH tools and methods, CC students can dig into data and learn about data visualization, conduct research in digital archives, and explore the relationship between humans and machines. Today, I thought I'd share with you a framework I use to implement digital humanities at my community college in Eugene, Oregon, which has about 8,000 to 10,000 students, give or take the pandemic. And this frame has evolved over time. I've taken what I've learned from practicing DH in the past decade, infusing my own curriculum with digital methods, and finally developing an entire course that transfers to the U of O, which is the University of Oregon, which is this behemoth that determines what we can teach and not teach, as a digital humanities course. So it transfers into their digital humanities major. When I first had trouble getting traction around digital humanities at my own community college, I couldn't quite understand the issues. I was in the weeds, really. But over time, I found that for DH to take hold in a community college context, we practitioners, whether faculty, librarians, cultural heritage workers, need to take into consideration these multiple things. Taken together, they can be seen as a kind of equity lens. And really, I should have been there all this time. So really thinking about DH at the CC as a Venn diagram helps me to think about how it can happen in community colleges, because for the longest time, I was just thinking that it would happen sort of as a course and that I could just get traction that way. And that just hasn't worked. So I'll talk a little bit about that. First, and here's my slide, I use what I call a whole student pedagogy that takes into account the lives of community college students. And with this holistic view of our students in mind, I've also adopted David Perkins' whole game pedagogy. I'll spend some time talking about that today. Next, it's important to distill for ourselves the critical concepts, what Meyer and Land call threshold concepts for DH at CCs. And articulating these concepts then leads to our curriculum. And I think we need to develop signature assignments that are scaffolded at a level that all students can meaningfully engage, whether it's freshman composition, 100, 200 level classes, and yet still be digital humanities. And this leads me to think about infrastructure. And here I include human infrastructure, such as professional and curriculum development support, such as this event, but also material infrastructure. I was so aware of this space because of this. From software to hardware to tech support and physical lab spaces. Finally, and maybe most importantly, for DH at the CC to take hold, we need to do all of this while keeping in mind our own discipline's content, the goals and outcomes that we teach to, that transfer and articulate with the upper division classes, especially given curricular streamlining from initiatives such as guided pathways. An eye on course outcomes is essential. And later in the this afternoon, when we work at the workshop level, I'll show you some of the outcomes that I work with. So let's take a minute to look more closely at the framework and ask ourselves, who are our students? You probably recognize this. Community college students are some of the most diverse and also most vulnerable student populations in higher education. The stats on CC students make up the pedagogical context for how we teach DH at the CC. And this was one of those insights that seems obvious also now, that I think when digital humanities began, it was in centers with lots of money and grants. And so to imagine that it could happen at community colleges where I know that Mia has seen this, the data on some community colleges, faculty work out of a filing cabinet, not an office, have overhead projectors maybe, but nothing like this. So really important to consider that. Faculty who teach humanities to CC students are almost never reproducing ourselves. And this is another consideration. If you come out of a graduate program, I got my PhD expecting to be teaching future me's, right? Little mini me's. And that's not what we're doing at a community college, right? And so to sort of, that takes a shift in perspective as well, and some humility for it to really happen. And again, that That's an insight that's obvious only in retrospect. Humanities is part of Gen Ed for most of our students, and we might only get students for one course in humanities. Again, with thinking about guided pathways, some students might get all their humanities taken care of even in high school, so we might not get them. So whatever we teach, it has to happen in the community college classroom and happen for everybody. This equity lens on open access institutions has to be responsive to the conditions of students' lives. And so I've brought up two that I think are particularly important, but each of you knows a much longer list. But one that I think is really interesting and has helped me think about DH is working class time orientation. And this came to me when thinking about how project-based DH can be, that students will be working for a long time on a project, often collaboratively, often in ways that rely on other students to do their part at a certain time. So at first, thinking of time orientation doesn't seem important or significant, but it came to me that without building in all kinds of slack into a term project for community college students, they're bound to fail, or some of them are bound to fail, and almost always not for their own, not because of anything that they did, right? But that they're working, their kid gets sick, all the things that happened during Zoom years, pandemic years, which I hadn't even thought of before. Has to do, we have to consider that. And so again, it's not just a simple, well, you're in the college classroom, you've committed to this, get it done, right? We can't take that attitude. I think it doesn't help. The other thing that I think is really important, and one of the, what would I say, the ethos of digital humanities at the graduate level, at centers, at well-endowed colleges, is the failing upward idea that, there's no failure in DH, that's how we learn. And there's a kind of swagger about that, right? But I don't think that the CC student context that works as well with this audience. Failing when, for many of our students, at least where I teach, it's not really an option. They don't have a fallback option. So this idea that, oh, don't worry about that, that can't be embedded in the in your pedagogy, or I've had to make adjustments so that everyone will feel like they belong there. And even if, I've had one student say, make it grandma proof is what she said. She was in her 60s and she was in my class and we were doing DH labs and she couldn't get onto Google because she couldn't remember her password. So just the assumptions that I made about everyone knows Google, everyone knows how to work with their passwords, everyone knows how to manage their own privacy settings, everyone knows how to share. That's not true. And if someone feels ashamed or embarrassed in a DH lab and they're having to raise their hand and all of the things, then they won't feel like they belong, and you might not see them. And as we know with CC students, sometimes you don't see them, you never know why, and you never see them again. So anyway, not to wax too philosophical on that. But so this holistic student picture and just thinking about belonging, uncertainty, and the sort of failing upward and time orientation, those are two important concepts to keep in mind. But also what David Perkins calls the whole game pedagogy, I think also is essential when working with this kind of new discipline, and especially when you're infusing it into classes that that you're already teaching. We have to make significant translation and develop a customized approach. I think that to have students play the whole game, not just little pieces of it, they have to see themselves in the whole picture. So there's enough of our students come to us working in jobs where they might do data entry. So just giving them a data entry job as part of a big DH project, that's not the whole game, right? It would be one thing if you're a graduate student and that's what you're doing. You already have a sense of the whole game. So trying to get students to always understand what they're doing in terms of the whole picture is one of the challenges. And so one way I've done this, you got to see Stuart. I just wanted to show you that that was his own query. He wondered about this question and about Walt Whitman. He dug into the archives and he comes up with this insight. Of course, it's an insight that historians have already discovered, and we can read about that in a textbook, but having come to that issue himself, I think that's how he could see how his work was in the whole game. The other part of the whole game is distant reading. And if you've ever worked with Voyant tools, they're really fun just to, you can just cut and paste any text and watch how it plays out in those tools. Students get to see that whole game as well. And we can talk about that more later this afternoon if you want. So playing out of town, a key concern of educators is knowledge transfer. And this is especially true in writing classes. I don't know if it's true in history and philosophy, but I know that for writing, the idea that they can get an A in their English class, but then can they write in their nursing labs, right? We were talking about this earlier. But transfer happens best in a context of integrative learning. And because DH is collaborative and cross-disciplinary, and it engages multiple knowledges at once, it's more likely to create knowledge transfer. Students who develop initial understanding across disciplinary boundaries then are likely to retain what they learn across contexts. And this is one of those areas that it's useful if you're talking with administrators who are wondering what kind of a return on investment you're going to get. Knowledge transfer is an essential return on investment for educators. So one way to play out of town, I think literally, is in this case, I learned about this from Matt Gold's Looking for Whitman project. He had his students and students in 3 other New York City area universities all collaborate on an edition of Whitman's poetry. And so I thought, okay, how can I do that? I don't live in New York City, where he's at the Graduate Center there. But I had a colleague in Bend, Oregon, which is a 3-hour drive over the mountain. And so I knew I wasn't going to see her students, and my students weren't going to meet her students, but they could work collaboratively on Google Docs. And so that's what students did. And that was a sort of playing out of town to see how what you do in a classroom, does it have any context? Would anyone know what you're talking about if you talked outside of the classroom? That's one example. Another is I asked my freshman writers to create FAQs. They come up with an advocacy project. They can invent something that they want to advocate, and then they come up with a website that's an advocacy website. And one thing they have to do is imagine, what would the FAQs be? What questions would you be getting asked so many times that you'd want to make an FAQ? So that's a way of anticipating audiences and playing out of town, but literally not leaving your desk, right? But imagining a different set of audiences and a future. So I think play out of town there is very metaphorical, I would say. So we need to make the game worth playing. This is what Perkins says. Conceptual knowledge that students feel is applicable to life beyond the classroom will support their curiosity and help them cope with ambiguity, especially when they're uncertain about the value. You know, is this going to be on the test is often the only sense of value that they might have. And so the more that we can get them to believe that it has inherent value, what they're learning, the better. So students, of course, are immersed in this digital world, and DH, I think, can help them understand it. One way to make the game worth playing is to choose generative topics that students can understand through active learning. So one of these, let's see. Sorry to pause. I want to read this, but this is in the way. Sarah created this Ngram. Has everybody used Ngram viewers? It's wonderful to get, especially if you go to the Library of Congress and you can find books that are in the public domain, and you can upload the entire text in just a plain text format into the Ngram viewer, and you can see all kinds of comparisons of what words show up in this year, 10 years ago, like pivot, for example. If we typed in pivot, we would find that that maybe spiked in the last couple of years, but 5 years ago, how often would you have seen pivot? Not very often. So Sarah here comes up with what she calls a good word cluster. And she calls it a science experiment with words. What she considers a good word cluster is where the terms interact with each other in intertwined ways. Whereas a non-good word cluster is where perhaps one of the terms charts high and varying degrees of usage, and the other terms are practically non-existent in comparison. So she's sort of come up with her own philosophy for how this is important and why it's worth playing. And here is this one on the lower part of the screen is man and woman. And you'll notice that woman as a word in the last 100 years, I guess it is, has kind of stayed steady in its usage in texts. Man, however, has declined precipitously, but then for some reason, right around 2000, it jumps up. So that's just like a spur to potential, like, what's that about? I don't know what it is. But anyway, that's the kinds of questions that I think if students take a look at, they feel that it has some relevance for them. Sorry. Next, working on the hard parts. One long-term project that I have students complete in my argument writing class was inspired by Bruno Latour. He created this online, massive open online class. If any of you have heard of MOOCs, they were trendy for about 2 years. And I took one with Bruno Latour. And in this, students curate newspaper articles from the library each week on a science topic and produce what I call key element inventories. Deliberate practice develops their information literacy and ability to tease apart the science and the data and evidence from inside the lab, from all the forces of politics and society that mobilize that discourse outside the lab. And by the end of 8 weeks of research, they've kind of done the research without knowing that's what they were doing, and then they analyze it at the end. So I don't call it a research project. But that's working on the hard parts, and you might not think that it's digital humanities, but engaging with digitized newspapers on a weekly basis on the same topic, and they do screen captures and these element inventories and then upload those into Google. Many of those are sort of tasks that build confidence in newspapers. Some students have never used the newspaper archives that we have until they do this project. So, so that's how DH at the CC can really happen. Sorry. So, and here's an example. And another thing, this isn't really a part of my talk, but if you're ever interested in issues of plagiarism in the digital era, one thing I found is that nobody writes the same essay here because they have to follow the science topic in the news right now. So nobody's written that paper yet. So, they create these screen captures. So I can go and find the newspaper article from yesterday or last week. So over the course of the term, they never even think of nobody's written it before. So there's no plagiarism problem. So that's not really a hard part, but it's a hard part for faculty. So playing the hidden game, I think the one thing about the hidden game is how do things work behind the scenes? And this may be one of the most important ideas for students in the digital era, because many of them, the younger ones especially, take all of the digital tools and information as a given. So they don't necessarily know what's going on, especially algorithms and such. They don't know why it's happening or what's happening. So using distant reading as a way to see what's behind, like what kinds of patterns of language are operating in any text, a speech, their own letters to their mother, I think helps to see this hidden game, kind of thinking about like a psychologist helps to see what you can't see. Learning from the team. This principle leverages the social and collaborative aspects of project-based learning, and DH is a natural fit. This relies on any resource that's in the public domain. And what I've done, so that it takes a little apparatus, but taking any text that's in the public domain, creating multiple versions of it in Google, and then asking students to create an annotated version of it. So when I was going to grad school, the Norton Anthology of whatever, poetry, American literature, was just the text, and that was our infrastructure. And it had tons of notes in it. And where did those notes come from? Students just assume those notes just exist. And by doing this project where they become the ones who are developing notes, they create an edition. It's a small Google edition of whatever it is here. It's Margaret Fuller's The Great Lawsuit. Now they come away and they do a sort of reflective essay on it, understanding what goes on with all those notes in their textbooks. Okay. Another thing, learn the game of learning. Again, not plagiarism, but if you've ever worked with students who have gotten most of what they're reading from SparkNotes, I try to go with the green lights, and I figure, okay, they're going to use SparkNotes because they used to use Cliff Notes when they were in print, but now SparkNotes and versions of SparkNotes are everywhere. So what I ask students to do, and they have to read at least part of the actual original text, is to improve SparkNotes. So they have to take the SparkNotes that are already available, print out a section of it, and then talk about what they would do to improve it. What does SparkNotes leave out, underemphasize, overemphasize, etc. So they do that in my women writers class on Frankenstein. So next, this is the whole game pedagogy, but I also want to talk briefly about threshold concepts. And threshold concepts are those concepts that help me to frame whatever digital project I'm going to be working with within the course that I'm teaching, whether it's a literature or a writing course. And if you have, how many people are familiar with threshold concepts? Is it something that, nope, not that much. Okay, well then I'll just read what Meyer and Land say about them. You can always look it up. They have helped me so much. So first of all, they're akin to a portal, and anyone who's had like an aha moment, and then you never see the same way again, knows what a threshold concept is. So there's once you're in through that portal, you'd never go back. You've learned it and you can't unlearn it, or they say I can't unsee that, right? It's transformative, it's integrative, and it's permanent. So whatever, in thinking about your own discipline, what are the kinds of ideas or concepts that until students get it, they can't get your discipline. And then once they get it, they get it. And for me with writing, I would say that revision, which sounds like, oh, you just write it again. But when a student really knows what revision is, like they literally see that they can make changes and that the thoughts on the paper are like another version of their own brain and they can change it around, then they never go back. They never go back to just thinking that it's about proofreading. So two threshold concepts or two ideas or issues in digital humanities are big data and digitization. No, those aren't the threshold concepts, but just the arenas where there are huge issues around big data and digitization that once students can understand them, then I think they have a new level of literacy about the information age. So again, we're in a new field. Digital humanities is still relatively new, and nobody has said, like, here's a list of threshold concepts. In writing studies, there are several very popular books that talk about threshold concepts in writing studies, and that's where I got the idea. I thought, if they've done it for writing studies, I can do it for DH at the CC. So with big data, it seems to me that the big concept is that algorithms construct publics, that they create patterns of inclusion and exclusion, and they create artificial cycles of anticipation. And through predictive analysis, they are non-transparent, and they occlude the criteria for evaluation. They promise objectivity, but they shape human practice. So that's Tarleton Gillespie, who, that's not his threshold concept, but that's his essay, the relevance of algorithms. And anyone who's really worked with algorithms can see that it's really about what goes into the algorithm, how the algorithm functions, that determines what is getting predicted. I remember we had an evaluator coming for a Title III grant we had one time, and he was doing predictive algorithms on students based on where they were from and what their GPA in high school was a predictive algorithm for how they succeeded in college. That sounds like maybe almost benign, but once you start making those kinds of predictions, you can imagine that certain high schools get chosen, right? And certain GPAs, students with certain GPAs are excluded. So understanding that an algorithm, it seems kind of fun, like, oh, I looked this up in Amazon, and now Facebook is showing me all kinds of similar dresses or something. That seems benign, especially if you've grown up in this era. But once you see that that's happening everywhere, and it's happening behind the scenes, as Gillespie says, the criteria for evaluation are occluded. So if you don't know how you're being evaluated, if you don't know how your behavior is being predicted, then you're just kind of in the dark, and that goes back to the hidden game. So trying to figure out how to teach this deeply complex, he teaches at MIT, idea at the CC level. That's like a translation that I've tried to do. And digitization, similarly, there are what I think of as 3 threshold concepts for digitizing artifacts. And of course, one of the things I think students love doing is to take whatever artifact they have, from a letter from their mother, you know, a photograph of their great-grandmother, and to digitize it and upload it to their archive. They create Omeka archives in my digital humanities class. But that's not, you know, ethically neutral. It's not neutral in so many ways, right? So a threshold, 3 threshold concepts is that digitization and metadata application is a values-based cultural construct and is not neutral. And that is similar to, because anytime data is involved, it's never neutral. Anytime it involves selection, it's often called objective, right? Do we have any objective data on that, right? But it is not objective all the way down, right? At some point, there was subjective criteria developed, and that's how the numbers, the photos got added. So the other one that came to me sort of late, actually, digitized texts and contexts emulate but do not duplicate analog practices. So it's not true that all things can be just digitized, just uploaded to the web, right? And also that it's not true that all should be. And so I think that's a critical ethical praxis question that we need to have students ask. So just participating in the digital world is always going to involve making ethical choices. And again, especially I think with younger students, I think those of us my age, anyway, I'll speak for myself. It always seems very ethically charged because I come from an analog environment. You know, when I dug in the archives, they were literally archives and pieces of paper. But our students sometimes, I think, they just take whatever is there and they think they can copy, paste, share, and it's all theirs. Because it's available, then they own it. There's a sense of no copyright, no rights at all. So teaching them to develop a schema for ethical choices is important. So I don't want to run out of time without asking for your questions. So I'm just going to move on. Imagining signature assignments that can approach those threshold concepts is, I think, essential because in literature and writing, the signature assignment was the essay and close reading was the signature method. And that was pretty much, if you could do that pretty well, then that's all you had to do. And so you can read from Lee Schulman, his discussion of surface structure, deep structure, implicit structure of signature pedagogies, what they do and how they do it, and also what a signature pedagogy is not. So the beauty of a signature assignment is that, first of all, it can move you away from the essay or the close reading in literary studies anyway. But doing so, you're always having to sort of keep those in your mind. Their students might be writing an essay in addition to other things, in addition to other projects. So finally, I wanted to mention about signature assignments that these can happen in different ways. So what I was able to manage in one class were digital labs. So we met, this was face-to-face days. We met twice a week in a regular classroom and once a week in a digital classroom. And it was, when I say digital, it wasn't like this. It was just a computer classroom, but it was enough that we could work, students could work side by side on Google Docs. And so my labs was one way to infuse DH into an otherwise traditional class. Another way was, and I think for many who are just starting, digital projects in the midterm final, or even in an in-class low stakes collaboration. Now, I did develop a course and I'm happy to share the syllabus and assignments from that that might be adaptable for your own purposes. But that course was really a highlight for me to develop one that took everything I learned online and tried to convert it all to the 100 and 200 level. So, and finally, digital rhetoric. Just the idea of rhetoric in an information age, I think, is also a way to get digital humanities into your classroom. So in some ways, that can happen without any digital apparatus at all, just asking students to be critical thinkers of the world around them. So 2 final points. I mentioned briefly about infrastructure and the affordances of your local college environment. It sounds like right now you're kind of poised to take on some of this work, but I will also say that community colleges tend to shift in funding. And so it's hard to imagine doing something that relies on a heavy grant funded initiative and doing it again in 3 years or 5 years. So imagining what infrastructure you need for any project is something to keep in mind. Oops, sorry. And I will put in a little plug for my book that I edited with Angel Nieves and Siobhan Senior, called People, Practice, and Power. The whole book is about infrastructure. Human infrastructure and material infrastructure at not community colleges. So it's hard to believe, but all universities, all of higher ed has the issue of infrastructure. And then finally, and this is what I'm hoping that we can focus on in the workshop portion, thinking about your own discipline, the course goals and course outcomes, and then using that as a filter. So with all of these issues, the whole student, the whole game pedagogy, threshold concepts, using signature assignments that will relate to digital humanities, while also teaching your own goals and outcomes, and have it be just like your colleague who's not doing digital humanities. Some schools work from a common syllabus, so I don't know how much flexibility you all have in that way. But I know that at our college, we all work from whatever syllabus we want to, but it's outcomes that drives everything. So anytime I develop any assignment, I have to be able to say that my students will learn the same things, and maybe in just with a different sort of lens, that students in a face-to-face class with a Norton anthology and a typewriter. So my Venn diagram, I realized made it look like everybody is really only wanting to do digital humanities. And I realized that the whole idea of DH at CCs is that actually it's likely to be very much in the background. And until maybe if you were able to develop a class, but if you're not, then it's going to be in the background, and all of these other issues are going to be there too. But really your discipline and the course outcomes are going to be what drive what you're doing. And for many of you, I'm sure we're all working at community colleges. I think it's the pedagogy and the student, as well as the outcomes, that are going to drive it. So even though I've put, because it's my interest, DH at the center here, I know that realistically, DH is going to be kind of at the background, in the background. So later we can talk a bit about other threshold concepts. And this is kind of, I went from the sort of high theory of algorithms to really what is it about? It's about making stuff. And that's like that maker ethos that I think is really drives DH. It's about breaking stuff, about glitches and deconstructing things, about taking stuff. In the sense of digitizing, I think of as taking, and that's why it involves an ethical component. Still involves reading, no matter what humanities discipline. Reading is not going to go away, but sometimes it'll be up close and sometimes it'll be at a distance. It's also about understanding permanence and the ephemeral nature of the digital. And that's even true. I had the most recent experience was so many of my lovely poems online that I had found were done with Flash, Adobe Flash. It's painful to say that I didn't, whatever I should have done before it went away, I didn't convert the format. So even there, understanding that what seems like, oh, I've backed it up. It's not backed up. It's just like, it's backed up for 5 years, but it could go away, very quickly. And finally, it's about knowledge making and not just knowledge consuming. So I think that's a real different frame from the education that I had growing up and in graduate school, that mostly it was about what was inside your head that you could spit back out. And that's just not the maker ethos of DH. It's really about what knowledge can you make? And, thinking about Stuart, I think he was making knowledge about this word property and his kind of shock and surprise that to understand its history and to understand the Civil War in this new way. Like I said, it's not that he made it for the first time and he's the only one who made that, right? But he made it. And so it's very different from reading that in a paragraph in a textbook. To have uncovered it himself and made that knowledge will stay with him. So that's all I have to say. And I hope that if you have questions, you'll stay and ask them. And then later on, those of you who are interested will do some workshop on your own classes. So thank you.
And thank you for your great overview about digital humanities. at the community college level. So we have about 10 minutes for questions. And then after that, at about 3 o'clock, we're going to start a workshop session. So if we want to actually look at these outcomes and look at your own thoughts, it's a great fantastic time. But I'll open up the floor for questions.
Thanks, Mia.
So you mentioned you like to gamma your assessments, the projects that you do. And this is something that I struggle with as well, because I do have students, I mean, they span the whole spectrum in terms of their technical capabilities. And I have found this to be a very difficult thing to do, because if I over explain, I find that a lot of students will just stop reading the instructions and they'll just say, I read I read the basics, and then they'll miss those key things because I just overdid the grammar proof stuff, right? And then, but then when I just sort of do it towards, when I write the instructions or, whatever, like when I do it for like the core students, they're like, fine, that's exactly what I needed. But then I miss all of those other students that what they were doing. And so I've kind of struggled to find that middle ground. Like what have you, what's,
Yes.
can you grammar proof?
That is such a good question, because you're really generation proofing it, right? Because we already know this. If I've taught 16-year-old students and 60+ students. Some students, if they have ability to benefit, they're able to come even if they're not graduated high school. So they're often faster than I am, at figuring stuff out. And then, yes, there are some students who are just, they don't understand where they are on the screen. They don't understand interface. So that's why actually the DH lab is a great intervention there, because then you can walk around the room and help the ones who need it and let the others continue. But I also think, can we ever as teachers get past that? I don't know, because I talk about FAQs. I have FAQs in my class. Students never read them. Nobody wants to read an FAQ. They want to ask me right now what their question is, right? And, we have this even in the commercial environment when you want to call the credit card company, ask them a question, and what they say, have you gone online and gone to this page? So I wish I had like a genius hack for that. And all I would say is do everything. And, I use screenshots a lot. So in some of my instructional handouts that are on Google, I'll give them the instruction and then have a screenshot of what that looks like. For some students, they're just gonna, scroll. This is the generation of scrolling. So they would just scroll down. But for some students, they're gonna stay with it and study it carefully and look for it. And then the only problem is their screen isn't looking exactly like my screenshot. So then there might be that question. So can you grammar proof? No, but you can try, I guess. And the reason I said that, that's a quote from Juanita, who I was at when I first just took this up. I said, what should we do in this class? Because she had gone through the term and we did this kind of reflective time. And she said, make it grammar proof. So, and I asked her if I could quote her and she said, yes. So that's a goal, I guess.
Before I ask it, I just want to highlight some things that I took from because we talked about the Baker ethos age, talked about the hidden game and seeing the underlying structure of language. But you also said something that I think really important, at least for my set of interests. That is that algorithms construct, create patterns of inclusion and exclusion, create artificial cycles of anticipation. So the question that I'm really struggling with is whether or not the digital humanities can help address the social fragmentation that we're seeing as a result. Our students encourage empathy, rise to educate the imagination, help address some of the social problems.
Yeah, well, it should be able to, right? If it's humanities, it should be like the magic bullet. But what do I really think? One thing that comes to mind is the idea of an epistemic frame. And that's another way of thinking about constructing publics. And, I don't know this group that well, so I won't get too political, but it seems to me that we're in a time in our country where we have two epistemic frames operating, and depending on which one you adopt, then that's your worldview. And it's almost impossible, it seems to me, for some people to see the truth value of anything that on the other side of the epistemic frame. And so, so trying to come up with exercises, this is what I try to do, where they can understand even the idea of such a frame. And that's the scientific humanities research that I have them do, is that they follow a topic in the news and they're trying to tease apart where the science is and where the politics is. Even that skill, I think, is something that is not the same as empathy. It's not even there, but even understanding that that maybe they don't see the truth. Maybe there's not, maybe it's possible that what they know isn't the world. So, yeah.
I wonder if actually we're not really dealing with the notion of right? With this maker ethos, there's also this hypersubjectivity where people
Yes.
feel that what they create should just be an expression of who they are and what they feel. With that notion, you lose this idea of an epistemic framework. And I think that's the fundamental challenge. So for us, we can say, yes, there are, let's say there are two epistemic frameworks. But for many of our students, the notion of an epistemic framework doesn't make sense, right? And in part, that's what's really underlying the whole notion of post-truth and sort of the deep cynicism about, the pillars of democracy, such as journalism and higher education.
Yeah.
So, my question is always with something like digital humanities, how do we leverage the resources, in addition to the analog resources, actually take some steps to help prepare our students for civil constructive discourse and participation in the public sphere?
Yeah, I mean, that's really a humanistic question, right? I mean, it's one of the big questions, like how can humanities study help with any of this? Like, can it be a cure for that kind of solipsistic hypersubjectivity that you were talking about? And so my answer is it can't, certainly not my 100 or 200 level single assignment in winter of 2022. That's not going to suddenly bust open empathy for them, right? So I think I develop assignments that each one of them aims toward that, and none of them will make that shift happen. I mean, I think we are not big enough in our 1 or 2 humanities class, even if we have, like Stuart was an English major. So even if you have an English major who's totally motivated to figure this out, right, then you still are only going to have him in 1 class and then he's gone or she's gone. So I don't know the answer. I mean, I think to me, knowing about Gillespie's algorithms is huge. To know that there's there's no Oz, there's somebody behind the curtain moving stuff,
Right.
I think that's huge.
Little nudges that we can make in our introductory classes.
Yeah.
We're not looking for an idea here, but I think we do have to start priming our students to understand some of the challenges that come with this idea that algorithms construct publics, right? Knowing that algorithms direct them to things that tend to reinforce their belief systems rather than open them up to different ways of looking at the world. That's really important. Whether you're at ENC 1101 or you're taking, an advanced class in the bachelor's program.
So yeah, I think we're just in agreement, absolutely. To know that it's true though, I guess that's the hidden game that I think is so important. I think many students don't even know that there's anything except what's in their heads. Mia was making this comment about in K through 12 that as a teacher physically moving a student out of the way because the student hadn't thought that if somebody's coming at you, you need to step aside. Like that level of like hyper subjectivity is it's an illness, you know, as I think, you know, kind of social psychological illness that maybe we're in it, you know, and I think it could be that Gen Z, very young students now, and the students who are still being pandemic babies are going to be the ones that are going to start to answer some of these questions. It might not be us. It's certainly not going to be a boomer like myself. I think I can only do what I'm doing, you know, but I can try, you know, and so that's, I think, what I'm doing here.
So much. How many more last questions?
Can you talk a little bit about, I mean, Stuart is that was a great presentation. But, and I do something similar, but on a much lower tech basis. How do you handle those students that will selectively pick something out in that sort of way? But, and you know, like what Stuart did, it adds context and nuance to a really complicated issue. What do you do with those students that selectively pick something out and they do just the opposite? They come to the complete wrong conclusion about what history must have been, you know, because you see that just as often as you see, well, maybe even more than you see the Stuarts. I mean, how do you handle that?
Well, for one thing, you know, yes, Stuart is, you know, just he's easy for demonstrating some of the principles here, but you know, there's dozens and dozens of students, and some of them, yeah, they don't have the sophistication to really do that close reading. The same students would read a different text that's not digital and come to the wrong conclusions. But the beauty of this assignment is that it's a capstone assignment and it's a presentation to the whole class, and students ask questions. So what's I think valuable about it is they might come to the wrong conclusions, but then there's other students in the classroom who are going to say, because it's at the end of the term, they all know each other. I don't think that, you know, you are reading that right, or and I think that's all that we can do, right? We can't micromanage their ideas, but we can create this environment where, and I didn't talk about this, but where there's unconditional positive regard. That's one of the keys to the whole student pedagogy that I try to develop. And we have that in the very first day of class. It's part of making it grammar proof so that grandma's never embarrassed, and somebody who might be wrong in their interpretation isn't embarrassed either, but they stand by what they say and other students engage. And that's, I think, also all we can do, or that's all I can do. But so the answer is yes, we get that sometimes. And, you know, there's puzzlement. But I would say it's more often, maybe not as sophisticated as Stuart, but often valuable as Stuart's.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you,
For your
Mia.
presentation and for your answers. It was fantastic.